The sun had already slipped behind the broken ridges when Caleb Brick eased his gelding down the shale-cut slope toward his cabin. Late autumn had a way of lying gold afternoons that promised warmth, then turned mean as soon as the light quit. The cold slid into his joints and sat there, reminding him that 40 was closer than he liked to admit. Hooves clicked on stone in a slow, steady rhythm, a sound that had been his companion for years. He didn't hurry the horse. There wasn't a thing inside those log walls that needed him to. For 6 years, coming home had meant walking into silence and leaving it that way. Work talked enough during the day, posts to set, wire to pull, cattle to trail, leather to mend, but nights were quiet as a grave. They had been since the fever swept through the valley and took Mary and the little boy, both of them inside a week. He'd fenced their plot with split rails, set a flat stone at each head, and learned how to put his head down and keep going because there was nothing else to learn. The cabin came into view where the cottonwoods thinned. He'd thrown those logs together himself when the claim was new back, when his knuckles were still soft, and he thought, roofs lasted if you meant them to. It leaned now, patched with mud where the wind had gnawed, the roofline sagging a little to the north. Smoke shouldn't have been curling from the chimney. He hadn't left coals banked that morning. Yet a thin gray thread climbed into the dusk like a finger raised. His stomach tightened. He swung down, boots crunching the frost-hardened dirt, and looped the reins over the post. His palm settled on the colt at his hip, the way a hand remembers where to go before a mind does. Calling out only tells trouble where you are. He'd long ago learned to let doors answer his questions. The latch complained when he eased it up, and the door gave on a puff of warm air and lamplight that didn't belong to the morning he'd left. The fire in the stone hearth was living good, throwing orange across the rough-hewn table, the one-legged stool, the cot against the far wall. And on that cot lay a woman. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were half open and watching him, black and steady. Long dark hair spilled over the blanket, tangled, wild. Buckskin clung to her frame, dirt-stained and ripped, the seams at the neckline torn until the garment barely did its job. Bruises marbled her arms. One cheek had puffed and gone that ugly purple-yellow, and her lips had cracked from thirst. She looked no older than 25, but her face wore the miles like a map that bay part of Caleb sharpened at once. He'd seen Apache women before, mostly at a distance. Sometimes in the worst ways during the years, some officer had decided a plains cowboy made a passable scout. He also knew what the valley did with a man who brought one into his house. Neighbors would wonder. Town would sharpen the wondering into knives. Questions on the frontier were only ever the start of trouble. His mind offered him the easy thing. Back her out the door. Point. She'd go. The cold would do the rest. Survival out here most days meant doing what you could live with, not what you liked. He took a breath, unsure which way it would tip, and then saw her hands under the blanket. They trembled like small birds caught in the child's grip. Whatever he'd been ready to do shifted. This wasn't a raid or a trap or anything with a plan. It was a human being running on the last of her strength. Mary's face came to him without permission those last hours when the fever took away words and left only breath. The boy's shallow, rabbit-fast breathing. The sound it made when it stopped. He had already buried a family once. Some part of him had decided since then that if another breath needed taking beside his fire, he'd be the one to see it through. He stepped in and closed the door. The boots thudded softly on plank. He kept the colt where it always was, plain and visible, and crossed to the table. From his sack, he pulled a heel of bread hard enough to require a knife, sawed an edge off, and set it within reach on the rough boards. Then he slid the plate toward her side, the way a man sets a thing for a dog he doesn't want to startle. She pushed herself upright by inches, and the blanket fell to her waist. The neckline hung torn and crooked. Caleb kept his eyes on her face. Her arms shook with the effort, but she got there and reached. She tore off a piece of bread and ate like a person who had forgotten what full felt like. He sat the stool and folded his arms, the Colt lying between his wrist and the table. The fire popped, the lamplight flicked. She chewed and watched him with that same steady gaze. No begging, no pretty story. Just the kind of acceptance that says, "You didn't throw me out, and I'm alive because of it." He didn't know her name yet. He would learn later. Nieli, driven from her own people, and then traded across hands not of her choosing until the last set of hands grew tired or mean or both. Survival had become the only job. Nothing beyond the next breath mattered. Caleb's job, though he hadn't said it out loud, even inside himself, until that minute was simpler. Keep moving through a world that had already taken everything that made moving feel like something you wanted. Two broken purposes crossing paths in a cabin built for one. Life loves a choice like that and will make you make it. He leaned back and felt the decision click into place. She'd stay tonight. He didn't sleep much. Years had taught him how to rest in pieces with one eye open. The rifle leaned against the wall within reach of his boot. He kept the stool and the fire, while she kept the cot and the blanket and the watchful breathing of a creature ready to run. Every now and then her eyes opened to check if the room had changed, and if the man inside it meant to. He hadn't and didn't. Wind pressed the logs and sang in the chinks. The coals went from bright to heartbeat. Dawn made everything gray and honest. He fed the fire without talking about it, poured water into a tin cup, let the sound of it do what words would only scuff up. He slid the cup toward her, the way he had with the bread, and waited. She stirred, blinked, sat up slow. When her lips parted, nothing English came. He remembered scraps of words from patrol camps, barks and orders and curses, the kind that don't fit in gentle sentences. Fine. He had never been much for speaking anyway. He watched her drink, both hands wrapped around the tin. Rope marks ringed her wrists, raised. He fetched water, checked on the small corral, set a hinge right. Each time he came in, she was where he'd left her, present, quiet, listening hard to how his days moved. The decision made itself the way some do, by appearing fully formed in your chest, after you've been pretending you hadn't already made it. She would stay. He could revisit the wisdom of it later. Nothing dramatic happened that day, which is the sort of day when everything important often does. His routine kept its beat, but now there was another heartbeat in the room to measure his steps against. By noon, the basin had gone low. He lifted the bucket from its peg and held it where she could see. She looked from it to him, the most ordinary question in the world, living in the space between. He didn't add words to it. After a second that had too many pasts inside it, she reached and stood. The blanket dropped. The dress hung wrong and revealed more than she likely knew or bothered about. Caleb turned his shoulder and opened the door, the way you give dignity even when the world hasn't. Frost bit her feet when she stepped out. The creek wasn't far, but hunger turns every small distance into a trip. She stumbled once, knees finding the ground. He caught her elbow and let go quick as you can, and still call it help. She looked at him sharp, surprised he'd chosen to steady rather than shove. Then she lifted the bucket again and kept on. The creek ran thin and quick, a knife-edged ribbon. She hissed when the water ate her fingers, and then didn't move them. She filled the bucket slow, like someone who has learned how to keep a thing from spilling by making the world wait. Caleb crouched and watched the ridgelines the way he always did. Sound carries. Motives do too. When she tried to lift the full bucket, her arms trembled. He slid his hand over the handle. Her grip tightened in a flash expecting theft. He didn't pull. He let the weight become something shared. The path narrowed on the walk back, and her shoulder touched his arm once. A small heat in a cold morning dot, she warmed herself by the fire while he poured the water into the basin. Wet streaked the dress where the creek had kissed it. Hair clung to her neck and chest tangled, heavy. He made work out of wiping the table and found suddenly that there was too much room in his head for this sort of noticing. Loneliness plays tricks with a man, and grief teaches all the wrong lessons about touch. He kept his jaw locked and let the flames be the thing worth watching. The day made a rhythm out of the ordinary. He cut kindling. She gathered the pantry into a neatness it hadn't met since. Mary. He saw at one point that she'd found his coat in a peg and stitched through a rip with thread too, thick and a hand too sore. The seams looked drunk, but held. He didn't tell her to put it down. Trades are the oldest language. Bread for stitches, water for labor, breath for time. By evening, the beans talked in the pot again. He slid a plate her way, then took his own. They ate without watching each other too much, the way new dogs will share a dish if there's enough in it to keep the peace. After, she stood on her own and washed the tins in cold water, setting them to dry without being told. That bit someone else's hands making a thing right. Again in his house reached into him and settled something he hadn't realized was still rattling. That night found its old seat, and he added a log. The rifle kept its station. She curled on the cot with the blanket wrapped high. The reasons to send her away lined up in his mind like bottles on a fence rail, easy targets. Men who hurt a woman rarely decide they've had enough of it. They'd come. If they did, they'd bring rope and whiskey and the kind of certainty that gets other men killed. He measured that against the sight of her bruises already fading in the warm light and against the quiet way she'd chosen to do small work without asking what it gained her. The scale tipped the way it was always going to, and he let it. He slept in pieces again. The cold found its way through the chinks, same as always. He could hear her shifting, trying to tuck warmth into herself. He sat the chair near the table with the rifle across his thighs and told himself he was awake, because he always was. The honest truth was less noble. He stayed up because sleep leaves a man loose, and loose men do things they'd rather pretend they didn't want. A gust shouldered the wall and rattled the shutter. She sat up with the blanket clutched, eyes on him. When she spoke, the word was tenderized by an accent but came clean. Cold. He blinked at the sound of her voice. It had been days since any word beyond his had lived in this room. He stood, took his coat from the peg, and draped it across her shoulders. She flinched at the first touch, then stilled, letting the weight do its work. The sleeves swallowed her hands. She kept his gaze a breath, longer than politeness, and then let the fire claim her attention again. He fed another split to the flames. When he sat, she pointed his chest, herself, the cot drawing a picture with her hands that said as plain as any English, "I'll stay here." He muttered to the floorboards, "You don't know what that means out here." Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. He ran through the risk again like a catechism and wound up at the same answer. The math didn't matter as much as the fact of her breathing. The shutter needed setting. He pushed it tight and turned back. She had drawn up, knees to chest. Without thinking the thought all the way, he fetched another wool and laid it over her. His fingers brushed her forearm through the fabric heat, under thin cloth, and he pulled away like the stove had snapped at him. She didn't jump, only watched him the way you watch a weather change. Careful, curious, ready to act. He returned to his chair and told himself lies that let a man get through the dark. It's just kindness. It would have been the same for any traveler. It's nothing more than that. Something in him that had been boarded over since the graveyard didn't believe him. She spoke again, softer than before. "You? Name?" The question floated across the glow, and sat between them like another log. He cleared his throat. "Caleb." She said it back to him, careful with the sounds. "Caleb." And she touched her chest. "Nye. A name puts a person in a place." He nodded. She closed her eyes soon after, breath evening into something that might pass for rest. He stayed where he was a while, repeating Nieli in his head, the way you test a new spur curious, how it bites, how it sits. He thought about the latch splintered, and the bucket shared, and the stitches that didn't look like much, but held. He thought about what it meant to hear her name, spoken by her to him, and realized the truth he'd been walking around all day. This wasn't a thing he could undo by deciding differently tomorrow. He finally stretched out on the floor near the fire, the rifle comfortable in its usual nest. He'd fallen asleep to silence for 6 years. That night, he fell asleep to another person's breathing. It filled the room in a way that made the walls feel like they had widened. He didn't mind the ache in his back. He minded less the ache in his chest. It was a different kind of sore. Morning found him stiff and not sorry about it. The coals still held a little red. Nieli was awake and watching him with that steady look that wasn't fear and wasn't challenge. He muttered, "Mornin'." She tilted her head like she could almost catch it and gave him half a smile that left faster than it came. They ate beans and jerky warmed in the pan. She asked for salt with a gesture and a careful word. He poured water and heard a soft syllable that was thanks even if he couldn't translate it. Each small exchange filed down the sharp edges between them. The unease didn't disappear. His eyes found their way to her without. That night the wind returned, meaner, pushing hard at the logs. He fed the hearth until the cabin breathed right, but chill still got in through the old seams that no amount of wanting could seal. She sat near the fire with both blankets around her and let the heat paint her arms. He sat across, whetstone and knife a steady song in his hands. He caught himself counting the sounds that weren't his or quiet hum in a language he didn't know. The catch in her breath when she shifted, the whisper of wool. She leaned in to place another split. The blanket slid. The neckline fell wrong. He set the knife down too hard. She turned at the sound and found his eyes on her. They held each other there a second too long for strangers. She didn't yank the blanket back into place. He didn't pretend he hadn't seen. Years ago, he'd promised himself not to reach again. The price had been too high. But promises made to survive a winter don't always fit when spring knocks. He stood and crossed to the fire, slow enough that another choice was possible. She didn't move away. Heat came at him from 2 directions, flame and her. He looked at her like a man checking the sky for signs. Fear? No. Weariness, yes. Defiance a little. Something else to trust, or the start of it. He lifted his hand and let it rest on her forearm, light as a whisper. She flinched because bodies remember first. Then stilled because will does. "Nieli," he said, making her name a promise. She took in a breath that held the whole day and leaned the inch it takes to make 2 lives intersect. His mouth met hers gentle, as if the room might break if he moved wrong. When she didn't pull, when she returned it, something that had been tied up inside him snapped clean. His palm found the curve of her waist. The kiss got deeper, slower. When they separated, color lived high in her cheeks. She didn't talk. She rested her head against his chest and let the fire write shadows on the walls. Later he lay on the floor like always, the rifle like always, and watched the rafters like always. But the always had shifted. He had crossed something that didn't have a name and didn't need one. Danger hadn't gone anywhere. It never does. But inside those logs, he wasn't by himself anymore. At first light, he stoked the fire and boiled coffee and tried to carry the morning like any other. But some mornings won't be carried that way. She watched him with a calm that wasn't resignation. Outside, He mended rails and made his hands busy to give his mind a trail to run. Smoke from the chimney told him where his heart had chosen to live. When he came back at noon, she sat mending the tear in her dress with the needle he'd left. The work looked like a first try, but the fact of it mattered more than the finish. She had braided her hair to one side, neat as she could make with what she had. She was trading being, someone who arrived for someone who stays. Hoofbeats stitched across the clearing before he could say any of that out loud. He reached the rifle without looking. She slid off the chair and into the shadows behind the cot, the blanket up, the breath fast. "Brannick." "You in there?" Jackson Crowley called, sitting high in a saddle he liked to be seen in. Caleb cracked the door and stepped through it, making the choice to stand on the outside, where men measure each other. Jackson tipped his hat and squinted. "Saw smoke yesterday. Thought I'd check on ye. Cold ain't that bad. You keepin' a fire like a man with company." Caleb held his face like the weather. "Stove draws better if it stays warm." Jackson let the silence poke at them both a moment, then spat. "Word is a pair of fellas been ridden through a skin about a runaway Apache girl. Say she took what wasn't hers." He let the words hang. "You be careful. I will." The words came even. Jackson turned his horse and let it argue with the bit on the way out. Snow dusted the ridge and didn't stick. Inside, Neely crouched where he'd left her, fear making her eyes too wide. He set the rifle quietly against the wall and crouched too, so they were level. "Men are look in," he said, the words slow for meaning. "They'll come." She searched his face and then reached for his sleeve with a trembling hand, not to pull him or push him, just to touch. Trust has weight. He felt all of it. That night, the fire ran hot but gave no rest. He took the place near the door with the rifle across his lap and listened to the dark the way a man listens for a rattler in tall grass. Neely took the hearth and looked at him now, and then, like the sight helped. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It had purpose. Caleb understood what he hadn't let himself say until then. If men came to take her, they'd have to take her from him. That asterisk sleet came in sideways at dusk, scouring the ridge until the cottonwoods looked like ghosts, their limbs glazed and rattling. Caleb barred the shutters, checked the door latch he'd mended that morning, and set a kettle to mutter on the trivet. The room glowed steady, a small circle of warmth fighting a bitter cold. Neely sat near the hearth, wrapped in both blankets, eyes on him more than the fire. She didn't speak much, but the way she watched said enough. She understood what Jackson's visit meant. The world outside had started to look for her. He cleaned the Colt slow at the table, motions practiced into muscle pull, swab, oil, reassemble. Steel in a man's hands can be comfort or curse, depending on what truth you're facing. Tonight, it was both. Neely touched the rope marks at her wrists, then lifted them so the fire could draw their edges. Her voice came quiet, careful, every word paid for. "They take me, chain." She tapped the scars. "I run." Her throat worked around the next sentence, like it hurt going down. "If they find kill you." The rag stopped in Caleb's hand. He had avoided asking for the details, because knowing makes a man see faces when he closes his eyes. Now he had enough. He set the Colt down and went to one knee in front of her so she didn't have to crane her neck. "Not here," he said, voice low and even. "Not while you're in this house." She held his gaze, testing if those words. The next kick split the jam. The door shoved inward. Lantern light swam. Boots thumped. And Winter came in on 2 coats. The first man through carried a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Scowl cut permanent into his face. The second was bone-thin with eyes that looked like they'd practiced cruelty. Rope coiled at his hip. Both men made the mistake of thinking a cabin is a place you can own just by walking into it. Caleb fired once and fast. The lantern shattered on the floorboards, glass skittering, flame licking at spilled oil-hot bright chaos. The first man reeled back, hit the doorframe, and slid to a sit that didn't last long. The second shouted, dragged iron, and sent a bullet whining into the log above the mantel, showering splinters. Caleb pivoted, found him through smoke, and pressed the trigger again. The second man sprawled half in, half out, boots tangled in the threshold, a storm already dusting him white. The room smelled of powder and singed oil. Fire licked greedily along a board. Caleb stamped it out with his heel, never letting go of the rifle. He moved to the door, peered through the snow-swirled black for a third shape, a fourth. Nothing but weather. He reloaded by habit, each motion blind and sure, then hauled both bodies by their coats and heaved them into the night. Snow took them like the land takes everything, without ceremony. When he shoved the door closed and dropped the bar, Nieli stood up from the shadows. The blanket had fallen completely. She was pale down to her lips, but steady, her eyes locked on his like the rest of the room had disappeared. She crossed the plank floor barefoot and stopped a hand's breadth from him. "Safe," she whispered. Testing the word for size dot, his throat went tight. He eased the rifle to its peg, found his breath again, and nodded. Safe. They didn't talk much after that. Didn't need to. He added a log. She refilled the kettle with hands that still shook a little. The storm beat itself hoarse against the walls, and inside two people sat so close their shoulders learned each other's weight. Somewhere in the night, a coyote yipped and got no answer. Dawn unrolled clean as a hymn. Snow lay deep and unmarked beyond a tangle at the door, where boots and blood had argued with weather. Smoke went up straight and gray into a white sky. Caleb shoved the door open with his shoulder and stepped out into a soundless world. The cold bit at his nose like a friendly dog. Nieli came to the threshold, and then farther, standing beside him with one blanket around both shoulders. She didn't scan the tree line like she had every other morning. She looked forward, chin lifted. The line between guest and staying moved a foot to the right and stayed there. "You don't have to leave," he said, still looking at the valley. "Not on account of me." She studied his profile as if it were a question she'd kept in her pocket for a couple days. Then she slid her hand into his. Not a bargain, not a plea. A yes. They went back in and made coffee and turned the morning into work. He carried in split wood and stacked it neat. She took down his other chair from the peg where it had hung since the day everything changed, and wiped dust off the seat with the tail of the blanket. He watched her set it at the table as if placing a stone on a cairn. A marker of where you are and who you'll be from here. Days turned into a small string of them, and the cabin learned their steps. The ugly purples on her arms faded to yellow, then to faint green threads, then to almost nothing. She moved easier, only pressing a hand to her ribs now and again when laughter surprised her. Her English came in like water, finding low ground first, a trickle of nouns and simple want, then verbs with their sleeves rolled up, and ideas that needed more than pointing could carry. He learned her words, two not many, just enough to share a thing without having to tug it across the room. "Water," she'd say, tapping the bucket. He'd try, mangling the vowel, earning a real smile. They hauled together, one at each side of the bucket handle, the weight a small pact. She fixed what could be fixed stitching his coat cleaner, now that her hands had steadied, patching a tear in his shirt with a piece from the inside hem, sweeping the floor daily until the boards looked almost new where the broom passed. He repaired what needed more than thread hinges, latches. The co-op door that had started to complain every time it swung in the evenings. When the work quieted and the fire took over, telling the room what to feel like, They practiced names for things. She pointed at the iron hook above the hearth. Hook, he repeated. She pointed at herself. Nieli. He nodded, the name already living in his bones. He pointed at the world outside, palm cutting the air. Home. She looked at him long enough for the word to change shape. Then she touched the table, the coat she'd mended, the cot she no longer clung to, his chest where the heartbeat lived. Home, she agreed, making it bigger. News rode the valley like weather. Jackson kept his distance, but other passers-by found reasons to pass by. A cowhand from downriver asked after strays, and let his eyes rake the windows quicker than a blink. 2 peddlers wandered up with a crate of tinware, as if tinware needed selling a mile from nowhere. Caleb kept conversation short and the rifle in sight. He didn't mention the night. Neither did those who might have suspected. Out here, some truths are understood and left where they lie. The 3rd week brought a thaw that turned the yard to soup and the creek to a low, fast rush. Boots came in caked and got scraped clean with a stick kept by the door for the purpose. She laughed the first time he swore at the mud, as if it had planned offense. The sound startled them both. He hadn't heard it from her yet, the clear, small sound of something that wasn't survival doing the talking. It made a pocket of warm air in his chest. One afternoon, he saddled the bay and tied a sack behind the candle. Flour was down to dust, salt to a scrape, coffee to stubborn ground. Afternoon, the stranger said, voice mild. Heard you might have trade salt pork for needles. That kind of thing. Fresh out of needles, Caleb said. Which wasn't true, but worked as an answer. Shame. The man's gaze flicked past him to the door's dark slit, and back. Snow got deep a few weeks back. Saw tracks heading this way. 2 sets. Later saw 2 sets again, then just one come morning. He let the sentence sit. Storm'll do that. Bury a man's troubles. Storms are useful, Caleb agreed. So's minding your own. The man gave a long, empty smile. Pleasure. He turned the horse with his knees and slid back into the trees without leaving more than a suggestion behind him. Caleb shut the door and dropped the bar. He stood with his palm flat to the wood, as if it could tell him what to do. Nieli was at the table, thread in hand, needle paused in midair. Men? She asked. Not today, he said. Soon. He crossed to the hearth, squatted, and added a log he didn't really need to. Fire made sense. It ate what you gave it and gave back what it had. People were harder. That night, he moved his bedroll closer to the door again and checked the rifle twice. Nieli drew the second blanket up to her chin and faced him across the low light. If come, she breathed, touching her chest, then his, we stay. We fight. He would have said it anyway. Hearing it from her put iron in the words. We do. Wind slid around the cabin with the cat's feet. In the quiet that followed, he found himself talking the way a man does when the room has earned it. I built this place for 3, he said, surprised at his own voice. We never had time to finish filling it. After the graves, it felt wrong to put another chair at the table. He glanced at the extra chair now, sitting there like it always had been. Wrong turned into habit. Nieli looked at the chair, then at him. She touched the table's scarred edge with the pads of 2 fingers. Now right. He didn't trust himself to speak. He nodded and set his back against the door. Morning brought a glaze of ice that made every step a decision. Caleb saddled the bay for a loop around the upper meadow while the light was honest. Lock when I leave. Open for me only, he said, tapping the nail. She nodded, repeated, only Caleb, with a seriousness that made him smile. Despite himself, the loop showed nothing but rabbit prints and an elk line high on the north slope. He turned home grateful for the absence. When he broke through the trees into his clearing, the sight met him like a hand on the chest. Nieli, out by the woodpile, sleeves pushed, swinging the hatchet wrong but stubborn, hair dark against the snow. She wasn't supposed to be outside, not with watchful eyes wandering the valley. But the picture of her there put heat in him. He opened his mouth to scold, and then caught himself, eased the horse to a walk, and dismounted. "Handle up," he said, taking the hatchet and showing the motion lift from the shoulder. "Let gravity do most of the work. Guide it with your grip. Don't fight the fall." She watched, then nodded, took it back, and split the next round clean. She turned with triumph all over her face. The grin fell when she remembered why she'd stayed close to the door. "Sorry," she said, English careful. "Don't be." He glanced at the tree line, then at her hands. "Just be smart." She nodded. "Smart," she echoed, and for a second the word looked at home in her mouth. That night they sat shoulder to shoulder again, 2 chairs angled to the fire. He carved a small length of pine into something that might become a bird if the knife told the truth long enough. She worked a patch of buckskin into a pouch with a drawstring. After a while, she set it quietly on the table in front of him. He tugged it open. Inside lay 5 cartridges wrapped in cloth dot, her face held steady. "For you," she said. 4 safe. He swallowed. "Gifts out here aren't about things. They're about choosing who gets to keep living." "Thank you," he said, the words simple enough to stand up. She exhaled, a sound that might have been relief or a laugh or both. "We keep," she said, tapping the table. "We keep us." He put his hand over hers where it rested and let the room say the rest. The following day the sky cleared sharp and blue, wind tearing the last tatters of storm off the hills. He took the bay toward the ridge line to check snares and found tracks at the high pass that didn't belong to elk, or rabbit, or anything that ate grass. 4 fresh cuts in the snow. Men. He followed just long enough to find where they turned south toward the ford, not toward his place, and waited until his breath evened out again before turning home dot. As the cabin came into view, he felt that now familiar looseness in his chest, the kind that comes after bracing and not needing to. Smoke in the air. A woman moving inside about small business. A bed that didn't have to be made in silence. He stepped in, stamped his boots, and set the snares down. "Asterisk, anything?" She asked, eyes on his face. "Tracks," he said. "Not ours." She nodded, took that fact into herself, and returned to stirring the pot. Eat first, she decided. Then think. He smiled. She understood how men work better than most men. They ate, and they thought. And when evening came, they lit the lamp and set the extra chair where it belonged and did not talk about who might someday come knocking again. They didn't have to. They'd already answered dot asterisk. The snow lingered deep into the next week, shining like beaten tin beneath the morning sun. Caleb moved through it in steady rhythm acts, breath, shovel, breath, his mind counting the strikes instead of the miles between him and trouble dot. By now, the cabin had found a rhythm too. Nieli mended what she could, swept the corners till they smelled of clean pine, and kept the fire alive with the discipline of someone who had learned to survive by never letting flames go out. She was quiet still, but not silent. Her English came in short bursts, broken pieces of thought stitched with effort. "Fire good," she'd say, feeding another log. When the storm finally broke, it came not as a whisper, but as a roar. The wind slammed against the logs, shaking loose the frost between seams. Inside, the fire glowed hot, their only witness. Caleb sat by the window, rifle across his knees. Nieli crouched near the hearth, her eyes fixed on him. "You no sleep," she said softly. "Can't." She hesitated, then crossed the floor to where he sat. Without asking, She placed a hand on his shoulder. "We live," she said, her voice firm now, her accent cutting each word. "We fight together." He looked at her, at the woman who had once been nothing but a shadow in his bed, and saw the steel behind her calm. He gave a slow nod. "Together." The riders returned the storm, carried them in their shapes, first guessed in the swirl, then real. 2 men on horses, maybe 3. Lanterns bobbing like fireflies against the white. Caleb counted them by instinct, muscle memory from days he didn't talk about. He motioned for Nieli to move back, his voice barely above a whisper. "Corner, quiet." She obeyed, crouching behind the cot. The first knock came dull, muted by the snow. "Brannick." A voice shouted. "We know she's here." Caleb stood still. The rifle felt heavier than it should have. He heard boots crunch outside, then the sound of someone laughing, a harsh, ugly sound that didn't belong in a home. "You kill our boys," another voice called. "We come for what's ours." Caleb's heart thudded once, slow and deep. "Ain't nothing here that's yours," he said, steady and clear. A pause. Then, "We'll see." The door shook under the first hit. Caleb braced his shoulder, jaw clenched. The second blow split the latch, and the door burst inward, snow sweeping across the floor. A man in a torn duster stepped through, pistol drawn. Behind him, another figure loomed in the wind, face wrapped in scarf and fury. The rifle thundered. The first man dropped without a word. The second fired back wild, hitting the mantel and sending sparks across the hearth. Caleb ducked, fired again, and the echo filled the cabin like a scream. When the smoke cleared, both men were down. The third rider turned tail, spurring his horse into the storm. Caleb stood breathing hard, the rifle still warm in his hands. The silence that followed was almost worse than the fight. From behind the cot, Nieli rose, face pale but eyes fierce. She stepped to his side, hand trembling as she touched his sleeve. "Safe?" she asked. He swallowed hard, nodding once. Safe, but deep down he knew it wasn't over. The world would keep asking questions, and someday the answers might ride in with badges instead of ropes. After the fire by morning, the storm had passed. The valley lay still beneath a sheet of white, the bodies buried deep by snow and silence. Caleb shoveled until his arms went numb, dragging what was left of the night far enough into the timber that it wouldn't draw wolves or men. When he returned, Nieli was boiling coffee, her dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. Her hands steady now. "You fight for me," she said when he sat. He looked up at her, tired but sure. "No," he said. "I fought for what's right." She smiled faintly. Same thing. He couldn't argue. The rest of the day passed slow. He repaired the latch, reinforced the frame, and hung a new crossbeam above the door. Nieli helped, handing him nails, holding the board while he hammered. They worked side by side, the rhythm of wood and breath and purpose replacing the chaos that had nearly taken them both. When the sun finally dropped behind the ridge, Caleb lit the lamp and set it between them on the table. "You don't have to run anymore," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "I not run. Not now." And just like that, the cabin, once a place of silence and grief, felt like something else entirely. A home reborn in the ashes of fear, warmed by the promise of 2 people who had nothing left to lose but each other. The thaw came slow to Sage Creek, the kind that teases more than it delivers. By mid-March, the snow pulled back from the fence posts in ragged patches, and the creek began to mutter beneath its crust of ice. Caleb rose earlier each morning to split logs still soaked with meltwater, the scent of pine sap clinging to his sleeves. He worked without hurry, letting the quiet tell him when to stop. Inside, Nieli moved through the cabin with a rhythm that felt as old as the place itself. She swept, boiled water, folded what little they owned into order. Every so often, she hummed under her breath, not a song Caleb recognized, but one that made the room feel warmer. The bruises on her wrists had faded, leaving only pale ghosts of what had bound her. She wore one of his old flannel shirts now, the sleeves rolled high, the hem hanging loose past her hips. When she caught him glancing at her, she didn't look away as quickly anymore. The shape of a new life, they fell into a kind of routine, half necessity, half instinct. Caleb hunted when the weather allowed, bringing home rabbit or grouse from the ridge. Nieli cooked over the open fire, careful and patient, adding wild onions or the dried herbs she kept bundled in cloth. Some evenings, when the light lasted longer, she'd step outside and stand by the cedar tree that watched over the graves. She never spoke while she was there, but her posture, straight, still, told him everything. She honored his dead without touching them. Caleb watched her from the porch, unsure what stirred more inside him, grief for what he'd lost or gratitude for what had somehow found its way back to him. Later, when the stars came, they sat at the table together, the lamplight catching the new lines in their faces. The confession that night, the wind rattled the windows again, but the fire burned bright. Caleb sat with a cup of coffee, staring into the flames. Nieli watched him, reading the worry he hadn't voiced. "They talk in town?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "About the men that came here. About you. Bad talk always is?" She didn't flinch. "I not hide forever. I know." He set the cup down, leaned forward. "But there's a difference between hiding and staying alive." Her gaze softened. "You think I make danger for you?" Caleb didn't answer right away. The truth stuck in his throat. Finally, he said, "I think danger found both of us long before you came." She reached across the table, fingers brushing his hand. "Then we share it." He looked at her, at the determination behind her calm. "You don't owe me that." "I owe no one," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I choose." That word, choose, hit him like a nail in good wood. For years, life had chosen for him. The sickness, the graves, the solitude. Now, sitting across from this woman who had crawled from death into his cabin, he realized something rare. He wanted to choose too, the night of understanding later. After they had both gone quiet, he found her by the window. The snow outside glowed faintly in the moonlight, a silver river cutting through the dark. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, his voice barely above the fire's crackle. She shook her head. "Leave? Go where?" "Nowhere home but here." He took a slow breath. "You sure?" Her lips curved, the faintest hint of a smile. "You ask because you want me stay." He didn't deny it. "Maybe I do. Then I stay." Simple words. No promises, no ceremony. But they landed like a prayer. When she turned back from the window, she stepped close enough that the light from the fire painted her cheek gold. Caleb didn't move. For a long time, neither of them did. Then her hand came up, small, deliberate, resting against his jaw. He didn't need to ask what it meant. The kiss that followed wasn't urgent or wild. It was the kind that happens when two people have nothing left to prove, a quiet claiming. When they parted, Neely's breath shivered against his skin. "Together," she whispered. "Together," he answered. The snow kept falling outside, soft and soundless. But inside that small cabin on the edge of the world, the ghosts finally went quiet. The spring thaw broke fully 2 weeks later. The snow vanished from the meadows, leaving behind the wet scent of mud and new grass. Rivers that had been quiet all winter turned restless, swollen with meltwater. For the first time in years, the land around Caleb's cabin breathed like something alive again. Caleb rose before dawn, as always. He split wood, fed the horses, checked the snares. But everything he did now carried a strange kind of weight, lighter somehow, like the air had shifted. The world outside was still hard, still cruel, but inside the cabin there was warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Nieli had changed with the season, too. Her skin had healed where bruises once lived, and her steps no longer carried the shuffle of someone afraid to be seen. She moved with quiet confidence, her hair braided to one side, her shoulders bare beneath one of Caleb's old linen shirts. When he looked at her, he no longer saw the half-frozen woman who had broken into his cabin. He saw someone rebuilding herself piece by piece, and somehow rebuilding him with her morning chores and shared silences. That morning, he found her outside by the creek, scrubbing clothes against a flat stone. The sunlight caught on the water, scattering gold light across her face. She looked up when she heard his boots crunch behind her. "Water cold," she said, wringing a shirt with both hands. "But I like." Caleb smiled faintly. "You're tougher than most men I know." She smirked a little, that rare expression she'd learned from watching him. "You say that to all women?" He leaned against a cedar stump. "Ain't met many lately to say it to." She laughed softly, the sound rolling like wind through the canyon, not loud, but enough to make his chest tighten. He wanted to say more, something about how her laughter filled the empty corners of the cabin, but words had never been his strong suit. Instead, he walked down, took one of the wet shirts from the pile, and helped rinse it in the stream. She paused, surprised, then nodded and worked beside him in silence. Their hands brushed once, twice neither of them pulling away. Old wounds, new fears by noon. Dark clouds gathered over the ridge, promising rain. Caleb carried the laundry back to the cabin, while Nieli stayed to fetch water. He was hanging the clothes when he noticed the first distant rumble of thunder, and something else. HOFB EATS. He froze. Out here, sound carried miles, and this one wasn't echo or thunder. It was steady, controlled, someone riding the trail at a slow, deliberate pace. Caleb set the wash aside, his heart tightening. He reached for the rifle by the door and stepped onto the porch. Through the gray light, he spotted movement far down the slope. A single rider, dark coat, hat low. He couldn't make out the face, but instinct told him enough. He turned sharply. "Nieli!" She came running from the creek, buckets sloshing water down her legs. The moment she saw his face, she knew. Men? "Maybe one," he said, scanning the tree line. "Could be scouting." Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. "They come again. Not if I can help it." He guided her back inside, shut the door, and checked the rifle's chamber. The sound of hoofbeats slowed and stopped altogether. Whoever it was, they were close enough now to smell the smoke from his chimney. A knock at dusk minutes crawled by. Rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, pattering against the roof. Caleb stood near the window, watching the clearing through a narrow slit. Then a voice. "Evenin', Brannock." Caleb stiffened. The voice was rough, but not unfamiliar. It was Sheriff Lyle Dorn, a man he'd once traded cattle with before grief. He led her the next morning. When the rain eased, Caleb took a scrap of parchment and a stub of charcoal. "What you write?" Nieli asked, something I should have said long ago. He wrote slow, steady, the words plain. "Sheriff Dorn. If trouble finds this place again, know I chose it. Don't ride after me. Don't ride after her. The land keeps its own justice." He folded the note and tucked it beneath the rifle stock. When he looked up, Nieli was watching him. Quiet, unreadable. "You think we run?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, we stand." The sky turned a dull pewter the next morning, the kind of color that promised both calm and danger. A light fog clung to the trees along the ridge. curling like smoke. The rain had left everything glistening, the earth slick, the air sharp and heavy with the scent of pine. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung across his shoulder. Every sound seemed louder now, the drip of water from the eaves, the slow whinny of his horse, the faint rustle of the creek below. He didn't trust quiet days like this. They always came before something broke loose. Inside, Nieli was grinding corn again, her movements careful, rhythmic. She had tied her hair up with a strip of his old bandana, and her bare feet made no sound on the wood. When she noticed him watching from the doorway, she paused, smiling faintly. "Good?" she asked, holding up the rough cornmeal. "Good," he said. "You make that better than any white woman in Sage Creek." Her laugh was low, soft, almost shy. "Then I stay cook forever." Caleb leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Wouldn't mind that?" For a moment, they just looked at each other. The air between them felt easy, warmer than it had in months. But under it all lay the unspoken truth, the danger still circling, waiting for a weak moment. The tracks by mid-morning, Caleb saddled his horse to check the traps along the ridge. He didn't like leaving her alone, not after the sheriff's visit, but he needed food, and keeping busy steadied his nerves. "I go with you?" Nieli asked, pulling her shawl tight. He shook his head. "Stay close to the fire. If you hear anyone, you take the rifle and hide behind the root cellar. Don't wait for me." Her jaw set stubbornly. "I not hide again, Nieli." His tone was quiet but firm. "This ain't pride. It's survival." After a long silence, she nodded, though her eyes told him she didn't like it. He rode out into the thinning fog. The trail cut narrow between the pines, still slick with mud. About a mile up, he found what he hadn't wanted to see. Fresh hoofprints, deep and recent, cutting across the ridge toward his land. 2 horses. Maybe 3. He crouched, brushing his fingers through the damp dirt. The tracks were sharp-edged. Less than a day old. Caleb's stomach turned. Whoever they were, they'd been close enough to see smoke from his chimney. He straightened, eyes scanning the tree line. For a long moment, nothing moved except the slow drift of fog. Then, in the distance, a flicker, sunlight catching on metal. A rifle barrel. He dropped low, instincts older than words kicking in. He stayed crouched until the gleam vanished, then backed his horse down the trail. He didn't ride hard. Not yet. Hard riding drew eyes. Instead, he made a slow circle through the timber and came up behind his own cabin from the east. Using the gully for cover, the ambush when the cabin came into view, Nieli was standing by the creek, washing something in the water. Too exposed, Caleb's heart jumped. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called low, the kind of whistle used by scouts to signal danger. Her head snapped up instantly. She dropped the bucket and sprinted toward the cabin. A moment later, a gunshot cracked from the ridge. The bullet split bark just inches from where she'd been standing. She stumbled but kept running. Caleb swung the rifle from his back and sighted toward the ridge. He didn't see the shooter, just a flicker of movement between trees. He fired once, the recoil jerking through his shoulder. The forest answered with silence. "Nieli!" He shouted, "I hear!" She called back, breathless, ducking behind the cabin wall. Her eyes were wild but steady. Caleb crouched beside her. "They found us." She nodded, no panic in her face, just understanding. "How many?" "2, maybe 3. Then we fight." Caleb gave a short nod. "We fight." Preparing the cabin, they moved fast. Caleb bolted the door, then dragged the heavy table across the window. Nieli loaded the rifle like she'd been born to it, her hands sure despite the trembling in her fingers. "You done this before?" he asked, surprised. "My father," she said. He teach me when I was small. Said men come, you shoot first. He almost smiled. Good man. She gave him a fierce look. He die for it. Outside, the wind was picking up again, stirring the trees. Caleb could hear faint voices now, carried by the breeze, low, muffled. He counted 3. They were close. He moved to the small back window and peered through the cracks in the shutter. One of the riders was creeping down the slope, rifle drawn. The others stayed higher, circling wide. They're splitting, Caleb muttered. One'll come from the front, one from behind. He grabbed Neely's shoulder gently. You take the back. Wait until you see them, not before. You hear me? She nodded, her expression hard as flint. You trust me now? He looked at her, really looked. At the firelight in her eyes, at the set of her jaw, at the way fear and courage danced together inside her. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. Asterisk fire and fury. The first man came out of the fog like a shadow, broad, rough-bearded, his coat soaked dark from rain. Caleb saw him through the crack in the door, waiting until he stepped into the open. Then he fired. The man spun, hit the ground hard, and didn't move again. Not another gunshot answered immediately, shattering the window glass beside him. Caleb ducked low, reloading fast. Neely! He shouted. Her rifle cracked from the back of the cabin, one sharp report that echoed through the pines. A scream followed, distant but real, then silence again. Caleb crawled to the window, eyes searching the tree line. He caught a flash of movement near the ridge, the last man, running low, trying to flank the cabin. Caleb took aim, breath steady, and squeezed the trigger. The shot hit clean. The man went down and stayed there. For a long moment, the world stood still. Only the rain returned, soft again now, washing the smoke from the air. Aftermath. Caleb lowered the rifle and stepped outside, boots sinking into wet soil. The 3 men lay still among the trees, their coats tattered, faces streaked with mud. He checked each one, strangers all, but rough men, the kind who made their living off fear. He dragged the bodies to the gully, covered them with pine boughs, and left them for the earth to take. Out here, the ground kept its own records. When he returned, Neely was sitting by the hearth, her hands clasped, eyes dark and unreadable. It's done, he said quietly. She looked up. You sure? He nodded. They won't be coming back. Her shoulders sagged, the first sign of relief breaking through the steel. Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside her. You did good, he said. Real good. Her eyes met his. We both alive, that we are. She reached up slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of his. By dawn the next morning, the world was washed clean. Mist drifted over the creek, curling like ghost breath in the early chill. The air smelled of pine and gunpowder, the scent of death fading under the stronger smell of wet earth and renewal. Caleb stood on the porch, hat low, eyes on the ridgeline where the fog still clung to the trees dot behind him. The cabin was quiet. Inside, Neely slept curled beneath a blanket, her hair loose across the pillow, dark and soft against the rough linen. For the first time since he'd met her, she slept deeply. No flinching, no half-starts. Caleb took that as a victory. He rubbed his thumb along the stock of his rifle, the barrel cool and clean, now after last night's blood. His mind kept replaying the moment when the gunfire stopped, when the forest went still again. It hadn't been triumph that he'd felt. It was something heavier. The kind of silence that follows when a man realizes he's finally chosen his side. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was protecting, and that made him dangerous again. The aftermath of violence, when Neely woke, the light was already warm through the window. She sat up slowly, blinking, her body still sore from the long night. Caleb was outside, hauling wood from the shed. She watched him through the glass for a moment. The steady, deliberate rhythm of his work. The way he checked the tree line every few minutes. She rose, pulling his old flannel shirt tighter around her. "Coffee?" she asked softly when he stepped back in. He smiled. "Wouldn't say no." She poured from the kettle, hands still trembling a little. When she passed him the cup, their fingers brushed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension that had lived between them for days, the fear, the need, the wordless gratitude, hung in the air like smoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up. "For what?" "For fight. For stay." He swallowed hard. "You gave me a reason to." She smiled faintly, eyes shining in the soft light. "Then we both alive because of reason." Caleb let out a slow breath. He hadn't realized until now how much he needed to hear her say it. The sheriff returns by midday. The sound of hooves broke the calm again, slow, measured. Not the thunder of riders this time, but one horse alone. Caleb's shoulders tensed. He set the cup down and moved to the window. Sheriff Dorn. He rode up steady, his coat flapping in the breeze, rifle holstered but visible. His eyes scanned the yard, the porch, the split fence, taking in everything with that tired, careful stare of a man who'd seen too much. Caleb opened the door before he could knock. "Morning, Sheriff." Dorn tipped his hat. "Morning, Brannick." He looked around, eyes falling briefly on the patched spots in the dirt near the creek. "Heard some shooting last night." Caleb didn't flinch. "Coyotes after the stock." Dorn nodded slowly, though his gaze lingered on the trees. "Big coyotes, I reckon." They stood in silence for a long moment, the tension as thick as the fog. Finally, the sheriff spoke again, quieter now. "You always been a fair man, Caleb. You do what's right, even when it costs you." Caleb met his eyes. "You riding out here to test that theory?" "Just checking you're still breathing." Dorn's gaze flicked toward the window, where a flicker of movement showed Neely's silhouette. "And that whoever you're sheltering's doing the same." Caleb's voice stayed steady. "She's under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know." Dorn nodded slowly, then looked out toward the ridge. 3 men found dead up that way this morning. Looks like bounty riders. No one'll miss 'em, but word'll travel fast. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Let it." "Yeah," Dorn said softly. "But when it does, someone meaner's bound to come asking." Caleb said nothing. The sheriff turned his horse, pausing at the gate. "You can't save everyone, Caleb, but sometimes saving one's enough." Then he rode off without another word. Shadows and light. The rest of that day, Caleb worked in silence. He mended fences, patched the roof, cleaned the rifle again. Neely helped where she could, carrying tools, fetching nails, holding boards steady. They didn't talk about the sheriff or the riders, but the knowledge sat heavy between them. Peace here was always temporary. That evening, when the work was done, they sat outside on the porch steps. The sky burned orange over the hills, and the creek murmured low, full from the melt. Neely leaned her head against his shoulder. "He come again, that man?" Caleb shook his head. "He's done talking. If trouble comes next time, it won't wear a badge." She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the last of the light. "Then we ready?" He nodded. "We'll always be ready." She smiled, faint and sure. "You like soldier again. Feels that way." He chuckled softly. "Only this time, I know what I'm fighting for." They sat that way until the stars appeared, 2 survivors breathing in a rare moment of calm. Future in the making days stretched into weeks. Spring took full hold of the valley. Caleb plowed the first rows of earth behind the cabin, and Neely planted seeds she'd saved from the bundles she'd carried with her. Corn, beans, and something she called chiwi, a bitter root from her tribe's land. meant to ward off hunger and spirits alike. When she knelt in the soil, she looked at peace, hands buried in the dark earth, face lifted to the sun. Caleb watched her from the porch, a quiet pride growing inside him. He'd never imagined this life again, not after the graves, not after the loneliness. But somehow, through loss and blood and chance, something new had taken root. That night, he found her at the fire, humming one of her quiet songs. The sound wrapped around the cabin like a spell. "What's it mean?" he asked. She smiled. "It's say, the wind carries two hearts now." He nodded slowly. "That's a good song. Better when you listen close." So he did. He sat beside her, the two of them in silence as the fire burned low. Her hand found his, and he didn't pull away. Outside, an owl called once from the pines, its echo long and deep, not warning, not sorrow, but something like a blessing. The dream that night, Caleb dreamed of the creek. The water ran red at first, the faces of the dead men drifting past him, but then the current cleared. In its reflection, he saw two figures standing side by side, sunlight breaking over them. He woke with a start, the fire dim. Niele still asleep against his chest. He looked at her, at the faint rise and fall of her breath, the peace on her face, and knew the dream wasn't warning him anymore, that it was showing him what he'd already found. The valley bloomed by late spring. The pines stretched green and full across the ridges, and the air carried the scent of wild sage and damp soil. The creek that once froze to silence now ran bright and noisy again, spilling sunlight in silver ripples. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel like a graveyard to Caleb Brannick. It felt like home. The ghosts of winter, the fever, the loneliness, the gunfire had faded to memory. But like all things in the West, peace was a fragile thing. It had to be guarded. Caleb and Niele worked the days with a kind of rhythm that didn't need words. He cut timber and mended the fences, while she tended the garden behind the cabin, her hands deep in the soil. When he glanced up from his work, he'd find her humming softly, the sound drifting like wind through the grass at night. They ate by the fire, their faces lit by amber glow, the walls no longer haunted by emptiness. Every now and then, Niele would tell him a story in broken English of her people's old ways, of the stars that guided her father through the mountains, of spirits that watched from the wind. Caleb listened quietly. He didn't understand all of her words, but he understood the meaning, that they had both come from loss, and somehow they had found their way to one another. The letter one morning, while mending the fence post near the trail, Caleb spotted a rider on the horizon alone, not fast, carrying no rifle in hand. The sun caught a glint of silver on his badge. Sheriff Dorn. Caleb wiped his hands on his shirt and waited. The sheriff reined his horse near the fence line, boots hitting the dirt with a slow thud. "Morning, Brannick," he said. "Sheriff, you've been keeping quiet lately. Been busy?" Dorn gave a faint nod, his eyes scanning the yard, the smoke curling from the chimney. "Looks like it suits you. Heard the valley's gone peaceful again." Caleb leaned on the fence rail. "Best it stays that way." The sheriff hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag. "Got something for you." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges damp from the ride. "Came through from the post in Holbrook. Addressed to your name. Thought you might want it hand-delivered." Caleb took the letter, brow furrowed. He hadn't received mail in years. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar Judge Lorne's clerk, an old friend from before the fever. He opened it with care. "Caleb, word reached us of bounty men gone missing near your property. Some in town whisper your name, but others remember who you are. A good man doesn't turn away the helpless. The circuit court won't ride north to ask questions. Keep to your work, Stay off the trails for a while and let the season turn. You owe the world nothing, but you've already done your part." Lorne Caleb read it twice, then folded it slow. The sheriff watched him. "That's good news, I'd say. World's letting you be. Maybe it's learning to." Dorn gave a small smile. "Don't fool yourself, Caleb. World don't change. But maybe you did." He tipped his hat, mounted, and turned toward the road. "Sheriff," Caleb called before he left. Dorn looked back. "If anyone asks about what happened here," the sheriff cut him off with a raised hand. "Ain't nobody asking. Nobody needs to know." Then he rode off down the trail, leaving only the soft rhythm of hoofbeats fading into the wind. Firelight and healing that night. The air carried the warmth of early summer. Fireflies blinked along the creek, and the sound of frogs hummed low from the shallows. Caleb sat by the hearth, whittling a piece of cedar into shape. Nieli sat opposite him, sewing the sleeve of a shirt he'd torn in the last rainstorm. "You think we leave here someday?" she asked, not looking up. He paused mid-cut. "Leave?" She nodded. "You not made to hide forever." Caleb smiled faintly. "Ain't hiding. Just living quiet." She threaded the needle again. "Quiet is good, but sky big. Maybe we go where my people once walk. Teach you their names for stars." He studied her face, the firelight painting gold along her cheekbones. "And if I don't understand the words?" "You listen," she said simply. "That enough?" He nodded, eyes softening. "Then maybe someday." She looked up from her sewing. "You promise?" He leaned forward, taking her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. "Yeah, someday." The Ghost Creek, that summer, a heavy storm rolled in, one of those that came sudden and mean. The creek flooded, tearing branches from the trees, pulling rocks loose. They worked side by side to keep the firewood dry, to tie down the roof tarps, shouting over the roar of rain. When the water finally calmed, Caleb stood by the bank, watching the current. It was then he noticed something half buried in the mud, a child's toy, carved from wood his boy's. The wind cut through him like a blade. He knelt, brushing mud from the tiny horse's head, the carving still rough from his younger hands. Nieli came beside him, her shawl pulled tight. "What is?" He turned the toy over in his palm. "My son's. Been years since I—" He stopped, voice catching. She touched his arm gently. "He not gone. He part of you." He looked at her, eyes wet from something deeper than rain. "You believe that?" "I live because I believe," she said. He slipped the toy into his pocket and pulled her close. The creek rumbled, but for the first time, it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like memory being washed clean, new beginnings. By the time the first frost touched the grass that fall, the cabin had changed. The roof was tighter, the door straightened, the fields behind the house now carried golden rows of corn and beans. The graves near the cedar stood tended and neat. 2 stones weathered smooth. Neil Lee placed a small bundle of wildflowers there each Sunday. She never said a word, just stood with her head bowed and her hand on Caleb's. On the first snow of that winter, Caleb carved a second chair to sit beside his own. When Nieli asked why, he only smiled. "Because I don't plan on eating alone again." She reached out and brushed sawdust from his sleeve, her eyes bright. "Then I stay? You sure?" he asked. "Life out here ain't easy." Her smile deepened. "Easy not mean good." He laughed softly. "Reckon you're right." The last scene that night, the 2 of them stood at the doorway as snow drifted down, slow and silent. The fire behind them threw a warm glow across the floorboards, the scent of pine and smoke thick in the air. Caleb looked out across the valley, the moon laying silver light over the land. "Never thought I'd see another winter worth remembering," he said quietly. Nieli slipped her hand into his. Then remember this one. He turned to her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Ain't likely to forget. She smiled, eyes glimmering like the snow. We live now. Not ghosts. Not lost. Just live. He drew her close, her head resting against his chest. The two of them framed by the soft fall of snow and the steady crackle of the fire. Outside, the creek whispered through the cold endless. A live dot, and in that lonely corner of the Wyoming frontier, where death had once made its home, life began again.